First question, please. Gentleman here.
Yeah. One thing, a comment first of all, if I may, and the forecasts, forward forecasts, where they always show a line going straight out once you've got through the original, the current short term. I've seen all this many, many times before, and I think it is something for forecasters to think about trying to think somehow in their forecast of the future when the next downturn might happen. Because one of the reasons I think why with the present recession caught us all a bit on the hop was the problem with forecasts in that they always showed a sort of great hockey stick growth. And it was rather obvious that something was going to happen 2007, 2008, because it was just not possible that the hockey stick could continue. That's a comment. The second thing is a feeling of significant optimism that I have, because I suppose I'm an optimist in general. But I thought about over a year ago, the thing that really hit me in the face was how sterling was devaluing considerably, and that I think that a lot of what we're seeing at the moment is a result of that. And is it really not something very important to us to realise that people who are involved in manufacturing the high-tech precision engineering stuff that the UK has always been good at, the export stuff, the trading, this is all benefiting from a really competitive rate for sterling. It's really noticeable when you go to Paris just how the change has happened, and that things are now expensive in Paris. They weren't 2 years ago. So I really think, and this really does go back, it's very, very important to look at history. This looks to me like we're coming to come out of this recession like we came out of the early 90s, based on exports, based on small new industries, based on flexibility. The danger, of course, is it all goes pop. How can we prevent that from happening?
Well, I covered quite a few of those points in my introduction, and particularly the dangers of just making these kind of mindless forward projections and not taking account of cycles and fluctuations. I mean, the trouble is that what's happened this time is different fundamentally from the kind of ups and downs we've had in the past, which I liken to sort of attacks of flu rather than a heart attack. And that's why the outcome is less predictable. I mean, it could be, and I didn't, you know, I was like you, I was trying to be fairly optimistic, but I mean, we could find that by the autumn of this year, we're back in fairly bad conditions again because of the withdrawal of the monetary support and cuts in the budget and so on. So we don't know, but you're right in the sense that economies are cyclical in many respects. If you look at property markets have gone up and down roughly every 18 years, going back to the 18th, 17th, 18th century. But people always forget, and they just assume in a boom period prices go on rising forever and they pile into property, and of course they then go down, and I would predict that we're probably talking about 10 years of stagnation or fall in real property prices. So some of these things can be anticipated, but we are dealing with a very, very exceptional problem. And on the second part of your question, you're absolutely right that sterling, the devaluation, which some people treat as a great disaster, has actually been pretty beneficial for people involved in international trade, with other exports competing against imports, tourism, universities trying to attract foreign students, all kind of things, and it is a benefit, and I would hope that companies take advantage of it.
We would have looked at in the past 5-year cycles for the economy, 5 to 6 years, around about that. The boom went on much longer than anybody expected. The forecasters were actually predicting things turning down in the early part of 2002, 2003. If you look at the data, that's what they were predicting. It didn't quite happen that way. And we all get so reluctant, we all get so complacent. We all think things are going to go on forever, and they never do. Inevitability comes at some time. It's just actually predicting that turning point. And if I was able to predict that turning point as an individual, I wouldn't be doing the job I'm doing now. I'd have done the lottery and I'd have retired to somewhere very sunny.
Next, please.
Other question for Mr. Cable. You talked about the importance of dealing with the deficit, but I was just wondering if you can tell us about what you think is the right time for fiscal tightening, because we kind of know that positioning of other major political parties. I was just wondering what are your views on this?
Well, when I was speaking, I argued that this is not a decision that should be made on the basis of party manifestos, because politicians are not in a sensible place to make rather sophisticated economic judgments. And what we need is a very careful economic calculation based on the strength of the recovery, if there is one. And that's what should determine the time and the speed with which the budget deficit is cut. My instincts at the moment, on the basis of what we now know about the last quarter of last year and what we suspect about the first quarter of this year, is that the British economy is in a very fragile state. It could very easily go back into recession, and that would not be a sensible time to start seriously tightening the budget. But equally, we have to send signals to the markets that we're serious, and we have been actually more explicit than other parties in listing the things that are going to have to be cut. And we broadly take the view that the government's 8-year programme for eliminating the structural deficit is really the weakest option open to us. We'll probably have to do more than that sooner than that. But you specifically asked the question, when do you start? And I think on the basis of the economic data we now have, it would be foolish to embark on large-scale cuts to take effect in the current financial year and the next one.
Hello, a question for Mr. Cable. Do you think a government should support one sector over another to aid the overall economy?
I probably have an excessively sort of puritanical view about this, partly based on having been in government in the late 1970s, when picking winners and picking losers was very much what industry strategy was all about. And it was a very bad idea having captains of industry and civil servants sitting around a table saying, okay, we think ceramics is the future and not IT, and ludicrous kind of strategic type decisions of that kind being made by people who are not qualified to make them. 5 or 10 years' time, we have no idea what will be the growth firms. Ideas will emerge from business and from science which we cannot control, and attempts by politicians to force this into a certain mould are not sensible. What we can do, and I think we must do, is to recognise that there are some broad things that the government should be providing, and I mentioned them in my address, in terms of a sufficient number of people who are capable of being trained vocationally, a sufficient number of people who can become scientists and engineers, and what particular branch of engineering is for the market rather than the government, and making sure that there's a sufficient infrastructure of a digital kind and of a physical kind to enable industry to expand. But sitting down planning the future of the British economy in a kind of Soviet style or sub-Soviet way, I don't think is sensible, and I wouldn't encourage the idea.